Thank you all for being here and being with us this afternoon for our keynote speaker, Michael Murphy. My name is David Allison. I'm the director of the graduate program in architecture and health at Clemson University. And we're honored to sponsor Michael's keynote through our Cecil Endowment, which allows us to bring distinguished guest speakers and faculty to Clemson and participate in our program around the focus of health and the built environment. Michael is the founding principal and executive director of Mass Design Group, a nonprofit architecture and design collective that leverages buildings as well as the design and construction process to become catalysts for economic growth, health, social change, and justice. Since Mass's beginnings, their portfolio of work has expanded over a dozen countries and touches health in all design, from settings for healthcare, education, housing, and urban development. Michael and Mass have received far too many accolades, awards, and recognitions to enumerate in the time allowed. But Mass was founded on the understanding that architecture's influence can reach beyond individual buildings. Mass stands for a model of architecture serving society, and believes that architecture has a critical role to play in supporting communities to confront history, shape new narratives, collectively heal, and project new possibilities for the future. Their work is concerned with the broadest possible definition of health, including individuals their projects touch, the settings and communities they serve, and our global ecosystem. It reflects an approach to the role of an architecture for health that we aspire to in our program in architecture and health at Clemson, and works to address the inequities in access to healthcare, health, and healthful environments in communities and for populations around the world. I first came to know Michael and the work of Mass through a presentation he gave on the Butaro Hospital in Rwanda, executed in collaboration with the late Dr. Paul Farmer and his organization Partners for Health. It is an amazing project, both in terms of the power of the setting it created to promote health and deliver healthcare, but also through its process of design and construction, which engaged and trained local citizens in its realization. My most recent firsthand experience with their work was in visiting the Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. It is one of the most moving and powerful places I've experienced in how it presents the legacy of African Americans terrorized by lynching, humiliated by racial segregation and Jim Crow, and burdened with the contemporary presumptions of guilt and police violence. He's also recently published a book, The Architecture of Health, Hospital Design and the Construction of Dignity, which I encourage you all to read. I'm honored to welcome Michael once again to Clemson and Greenville and our conference on health and all design, which has been a guiding principle for his work over his career. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, David. It's really an honor to be back here and inspired by what you all are doing at Clemson and keeping the candle lit to integrate design and health. It's something we need more of, so I'm just grateful to be back, and thanks for that nice introduction. And welcome all of you. Glad to be here with you. Maybe I can start the slide. Here we go. I thought, I actually thought I would just begin with everyone kind of doing something together, which is maybe we could all take like a big, deep breath and let it out. I'm asking you to do that because I'm actually grateful that you all are here. I'm grateful for you all joining in person and calculating the risks that emerge from being together in person. It's not lost on me because there is obviously tension in the air. There's tension in the air of being together. There's tension in the air of the pathogens that are in the air. Are we infecting each other right this very moment? Are we causing harm on each other? This kind of question is now ever present in all of our lives and all the spaces that we inhabit. And we start to think, at least as spatially trained individuals, that we start looking at the spatial volume of the room, We start to ask if the air is mixing well, if the air systems are working well, are they protecting us? Is the air handling system working effectively? Can we calculate the air changes per hour that we're seeing around us? Are there windows, which there are not in this room? What can we make visible to the untrained eye? What of the invisible can we make visible? What, as spatial experts and designers, can we calculate and show and reveal about breathability in the spaces around us? How are we making each other more safe and more protected? I ask all these questions because I think there's something going on right now in the middle. We're in the middle of this incredible paradigm shift in the world in spatial thinking. It's really an awakening. And the entire world is undergoing it with us simultaneously. They're asking the questions that I just asked, that we are asking in every space, in every location, every day, that we in this room are probably asking. And we're poised, I think, and prepared to train to think about and solve for, visualize, communicate, address, that the spaces around us can protect us or they can hurt us. It suggests a sort of new, what I would call a new essentialism in the discipline of design, and especially the disciplines of design and health, that both gives me a great sense of hope, but also, a sense of fear. I don't think I would be off kilter to suggest that not everyone considers the work of designers and architects essential, that design and spatial disciplines have had impact on social conditions, on our health, on our behavior. That question has been debated. Well, I think this debate that space itself shapes us, shapes our health, is no longer a debate. It melted into irrelevance in the past 2 years, and suddenly everyone knew, now huddled in our apartments, afraid to enter restaurants, public spaces, and hospitals, that buildings can hurt us. And if they hurt us, the obvious next question is, can they heal us? I think the other reflection I have of that is that there is a kind of sense of a new spatial rights that have been revealed in the last few years, and how those rights are impeded. Our ability to breathe is both a crisis of health access, but it's also a crisis of the fundamental access to clean air, something that the buildings around us modulate and facilitate. That the buildings we are in could determine whether we have access to air that is uncontaminated, that is healthy, or poisoned, is a reckoning of the built environment. It's also an opportunity to ground the work that we do as designers and architects in the most basic of fundamental rights, the right to breathe. And that itself is a liberating moment. With that in mind, the spatial disciplines, of which, of course, architecture is understood fundamentally to be a guide, its relevance, which had often been bemoaned, becomes grounded and essentialized firmly in the realm of rights provided, rights abused, rights allocated, and more importantly, the right to breathe. In this way, I think breathing then becomes something like a spatial problem, something that we can find new solutions to, and the world around us is looking for us collectively to address. I then leave you with a kind of prompt for the following presentation I'm about to give, which is, do we have a right to architecture? Well, if it shapes our right to breathe, if it shapes our rights to live healthfully, if it shapes our rights to equal provisions, then it is a right and not simply a privilege. And if it is a right, then we have a responsibility to fight for those rights. This call for me during this pandemic, even though it's been a through line of my practice, a sort of hopeful aspiration, has been grounded in reality. It's become essential. It's facilitated a sort of sense of purpose, which drove me to write this book that I'll present today. But I think it was first kind of seated in my brain outside when I was a first architecture student in 2006, outside of my first final review, when I found myself in a medical facility and had these questions first asked. I'll tell that story quickly, which is that it was the end of my first final review of my first semester of architecture school. And I had been up, David was talking to me about mental health of architecture students and how much we have to take care of them. I think that's true. I was up for like 3 days working on my first final project. And I hadn't checked my cell phone for 3 days. And I came out of the review, the crit review, and there was like 26 missed calls, all from my mother. And I listened to, my father had been sick with cancer for the last 2 years before I had been in school, and he had been in remission. The first message was, your father has gone into septic shock. We're in an ambulance. We're going to New York City. We live about 2 hours north of the city. The second was, where are you? The third is, how could I get in touch with you? And I didn't know what 25th was. Maybe he had passed away while I had been trying to figure out how to squeeze a meaningless YMCA in an old train track scenario, something that I didn't do so well, and I was butchered for by my jury. I kind of sat down in the middle of the room in the hallway and wondered, what was going to happen. And just at that time, a friend came in searching for me. My mother had called her and said, your father's alive, but just barely, and I'm going to take you to New York, at that time from Boston. And so we jumped on the car right then to go find him. And it was that kind of existential moment. I found myself in a hallway like this, in a plan like this, in a famous hospital that I won't mention, well known for its treatment of care, but in a space that seemed to lack all of the things that I had been, or had been proposed to be taught about the value of architecture and design. This racetrack plan, or this block hospital typology, where this deep interior, where all the mechanical systems and all the movement and all of the functioning of the medical facility happens, is sort of evident of what happened to the hospital in the mid-century. And I sort of asked myself, what has made this place so indifferent to the human experience? Why the indignity? And where's the design? That experience in my first semester, faced with the life or death of my father, really drove and seeded in my mind that there was a problem here, this thing that could keep him alive, but also not addressing his whole person. At some point, facing tragedy or joy, most of us will spend days, if not weeks, in a hospital, coping with this existential realities of birth or illness or death. Our rights are right in front of us. The right to healthcare, the ability to live a few more days, was determined by our ability to have life-saving care. The space around us functioned to keep, in this case, my father alive and serve his medical condition. We were grateful for that. But the experience, the feeling, the fear, the lighting, the room, the details, the institution, the institutionality of it that we had to navigate blindly with anxiety and terror, these things were not serving his entire person, his entire condition. And it was forcing me to wonder about this other right, this right to dignity that we begin to talk about. My father's hospital journey both served his humanity and his medical condition. I could say that's true, but rarely I would say at the same time. There was this bipolar situation where not both were being served. I had to wonder there if the role of design could be to manage this conflict, to sort of soften the blow of the irrelevance of the systems around us that remind us that we still matter within that invisible vastness of the unfathomable systems that we're forced to reckon with. The right to health, the right to dignity, the right to breathe all seemed, in this case, spatially determined. And I wanted to search for answers of both how we as designers have advanced these rights and how we've hindered them. And that's really the premise of this book that came out last year in December. And it's a compendium show at the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, the Smithsonian in New York. And it's a journey towards a thesis of how we should think about the built world today, not just hospitals, but the built world as a living and active and productive and destructive agent in our ability to access these rights. We do deserve a dignified experience in the public institutions that are life's great thresholds. It's not as obvious to everyone, but it's obvious to us. And buildings are modulating this experience of rights. Not surprisingly, as the title suggests, we find all of this grounding and first principles of architecture most clearly communicated, I think, within the hospital typology itself. And so focusing on the hospital gives us an elemental set of discussion points around how architecture serves us and shapes our lives. It begins really with foundational systems thinkers who have thought about this both within and without our discipline. Florence Nightingale on the left is in particular a kind of heroine of this systems approach to thinking about care, policy, design, interiors, infrastructure, space saving measures, and metrics. Her work, the Nightingale Ward in particular, which I'll talk about, It came out of a study of medical facilities built during the Crimean War by Isambard Brunel. I'll mention that in a little bit. And her work went on to influence hospitals around the world from the 1860s on, really for the next half century, and usher in a modern design movement itself, the sanitation era among it, all based on ideas of how health and design were interrelated in really a parametric relationship between staff and patients, and in her new estimation, the movement of air, and in that case, miasmatic odors. Here for Nightingale, airflow, or the window in particular, becomes really the operational interface for how our health and the climate around us are always present in our buildings and hospitals, and have been at the forefront of this experimentation and calibration for the last 2 centuries. This shows up in hospitals around the world. In particular, this is the Hospital de la Santa Cruz, São Paulo, in Barcelona by Dominique Montiner, which is a powerful example of the sort of Nightingale principles being built even in the beginning of the modern era, kind of shaping how the spaces around us and the medical facilities that we're reckoning with are also both a form of statecraft, but also places where we can find respite and treatment. All of this came really present to me, as David mentioned, when I came back to school and met this amazing man, Dr. Paul Farmer, who really began this journey for me. And Paul, who passed away this February of a heart attack, was really my mentor to help me think about how airflow was so important in medical facilities, and gave us our first opportunity to take the principles that Nightingale had promoted, but apply them to the modern world. Paul's organization, Partners in Health, has been doing fundamental care, healthcare for all, in a rights-based paradigm, but also infrastructure development across the world, in particular communities that are most underserved. Haiti in particular is where it began, but he's worked around the world. And in Rwanda, where they were starting operations with the Ministry of Health in 2005, I met him at a lecture and asked him who the architects he was working with were. And he said, architects have never reached out to us to see how they can be of help. What can you do to serve us, instead of how can you win a commission, I think is the question he asked me. And in that case, I went, instead of working for an architecture firm, I went to work with his organization, and he brought me to Rwanda. Rwanda at that period of time in 2006 was asking these same questions about what's a new sense of infrastructure, what's a new type of performative facility, and how do we reduce airborne disease infections at the medical facility itself. This was, in this case, it was the outbreak of tuberculosis, or multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And Paul and his team had been designing medical facilities and clinics around the reduction in airborne disease infection. What would he say? He would say, keep all the patients in the exterior. In this case, no hallways, remove all the hallways from the facility. A notion that Nightingale would have supported. Herman Hertzberger would support this idea as well. Many other designers and architects have thought about the problem of the hallway. Well, in the condition of the healthcare facility in the kind of rural setting, it's the hallway where patients were sitting and contaminating each other. These were the spaces undesigned for airflow. These are the spaces that we've now all encountered during the pandemic, the spaces that hadn't thought about contagion and pathogen infection. So our design for this facility, which began with Paul and his team, was based around removing, sorry, you jumped a little bit ahead, removing the hallway and putting it on the exterior and making patients circulate in the exterior. Yeah, let's see, you're going way back. Here we go. We designed this with his team in 2006. It was finished in 2011 and became really a powerful testament to how we could, again, remind ourselves of how buildings perform and how they breathe. Of course, a building isn't just about its functionality, it's also about how it's made. And the idea of the building emerging from this ground after this sort of state is investing in its first infrastructure, often the hospital is its first infrastructure it invests in, was also about the place it's from, this volcanic rock region. This is Hakiza, one of the masons who worked on this, on the facility, handcrafting all this stonework into this beautiful, customized, handcrafted facility, which really speaks to the place of which it's made and the handcraftedness of every single one of those stones. This idea of beauty as being a part of it as well is the interrelationship of the beauty and the facility's functionality make this place both symbolic, a memorial to the place itself, as well as a commitment to its performance of health outcomes, as we learned from Florence Nightingale early on. We looked at other precedents, of course, as well. This is Alto's Paima Sanatorium from the 1930s. This was also designed around solving the health crisis of tuberculosis patients. In this case, Alto really created what we call a thin floor plate, a tall, wind-borne form, in essence, something that's really hard to add to because it's driven by this thinness and these outdoor porches where patients would come and get what they called the cure, sit outside in the cold Finnish air during the winter, covered in big blankets on chaise lounges, addressing their health crisis. Beatrice Colomina, in her recent book, X-Ray Architecture, cites the Paima Sanatorium in Alvarado as really one of the foundational architectures of the modern era, and makes more of a case that it was health ideas of changing our behavior in our lives, which drove many of the fundamental aesthetic, what have become called aesthetic decisions around modern architecture. But from Neutra, who I know people are speaking about today, and Breuer, even into the early mid-century, into the war years, these very ideas of performance, provenance, and health drove the changing modalities of architecture itself. These ideas also influenced the way we started to think about new state hospitals. This is the Nyarugenge Hospital in Rwanda, a new state facility which opened this last year. And in this case, taking those same precedents we learned from Butaro, but adapting them to a new modern guidelines and protocols that we helped write with the country. We decided to wrap the building in a hallway itself. You can see the hallway is the modulating interface of the facade system. The ramp of which you climb the building also becomes the separated to manage the climate. Of course, it also allows it to breathe. Becomes the sort of design driver of how people both circulate, but also are able to decontaminate the environment around them. Also allows an incredible opportunity for plantings and shadings and gatherings in a kind of public realm that the hospital is itself. It has many surfaces and facades. Here in the back where the private, let's say the wards are, they have their own large porches and openings to allow, again, for that airflow to come into the wards, but also a kind of symbol of the city's commitment to its health infrastructure. This became the COVID center during the pandemic and has been a real success in terms of driving new policy changes in the government. These same ideas led us to think about other facilities that are disease specific, in this case, a tuberculosis hospital itself in Haiti that opened after the earthquake. Multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, again, an airborne disease, is particularly traumatic in the drug regimen that patients have to take, often leading to a kind of almost psychotic reactions to the drugs. In the condition during the earthquake, many of the patients were living in these hot tents that were temporary, taking these intense drug regimens, and suicide attempts were very common. Dr. John Popp, who is the leader of GESCIO, this organization, recounted to us that after they constructed this facility, the suicide attempts dropped to zero, and the patient's level of calmness and care in their drug treatment, which takes many months sometimes, was much more positive and effective. Kind of measurement a little bit of what it means to change our environment and to ensure that the treatment programs are working. This facility opened in 2015, but again, it's designed around airflow management and also around because we know these patients are already sick with airborne disease, it's designed around the relationship between the doctor and the staff. I don't know if you can, there you go. Where we designed separate doors to the bathrooms and the rooms so that the doctors and the staff were always meeting the patients outside instead of inside their rooms. Much of this led us to dig a little deeper into the history of disease and its relationship to our built world, and how much we found about how design has been shaped by disease and how disease has shaped design. And this has led to this new show at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, which is up now. I encourage you, if you're in New York, to take a look. It's up until early next year to really show this history. We curated this show that accompanies the book. The show's called Design and Healing: Creative Responses to Epidemics. And we were beginning this curation of the show before the pandemic emerged in 2019. and then actively we're changing the design and the precedents that we're using during the pandemic to show how these very things were happening in real time. It was an incredible experience, an incredible institution to work with, but also showed how much interrelationship and dialogue is between these two disciplines. Probably no greater example is this kind of foundational case of John Snow's map of London and the outbreak of cholera in the 1854. The response then was a sort of an awakening that disease was not morally born, but it was spatially born or waterborne. And the cities and the city design was sort of reshaped to address and resist disease pathogen. But cities today are different than they were in the 19th century. Of course, this is Port-au-Prince, Haiti, where the worst cholera outbreak of the 20th century emerged in 2012. Why it occurred is known: a kind of lack of wastewater infrastructure, failing pipes, historically disinvested systems, and rapid devastation after the earthquake of 2011. But I think more to the point is how we cope with these acute on chronic, as Paul would say, conditions in the contemporary city, and how we need to build an alternate strategy to address diseases we have long known how to treat. We can treat them, we just can't have the infrastructure that treats them. So science is not so much the issue, it's the infrastructure, it's the design of the built environment, which was the problem. I love this image because this is the road that you see in the middle is Boulevard Harry Truman, built with US aid dollars as part of just after the occupation of the US occupation of Haiti. And it was built at that time on the water's edge. So the whole city called City of God, Cité de Dieu, on the right-hand side, with about 75,000 people live, is the kind of contemporary ungridded city of Port-au-Prince. On the left is the gridded piped infrastructure, historic city of Port-au-Prince, designed for about 1 million people with about 4 million people living there. This sort of interrelationship of infrastructure, failed infrastructure, new ways of settlement patterning is all exemplary in this image, and the clinic that we designed is right at the center of it, at that intersection, at that interface, at that threshold. This is the Jesquio, same client, different project, cholera treatment center, which at this point was designed to address the cholera outbreak, but also additional waterborne or diarrheal diseases. And in this condition, we designed the facility around actually bringing as many of the cholera patients together in one place, pushing against the temporary clinics that were put up, which only had a sort of obviously a limited lifespan, and creating what we call a semi-permanent piece of infrastructure. The facility is built above a wastewater treatment facility that we developed in partnership with civil engineers so that the wastewater is collected and decontaminated on site, resisting the need for the piped infrastructure and sort of centralized water treatment facility, but instead doing it locally. We thought this might be an opportunity to replicate this throughout the city and address the kind of condition of transmission that might be happening in, around the city and the region. It has since become, obviously, the clinic of Cité de Dieu, where there are no cholera cases recorded and people are coming in far from the hinterland to the center, but it also became, again, the COVID clinic during the outbreak. One of the other great minds of the 19th century we talk about in the show, but also I think in our research has been really powerful, is Isambard Brunel. I don't know if you can click, sorry, maybe click forward if you can for me, please. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, one of the great names also. His work on the Rencoy Hospital during the Crimean War was really the inspiration that Florence Nightingale saw when she, and it was inspired by when she saw this clinic. You may know the story of the clinic. Brunel designed a prefabricated field hospital. It could be made in England, shipped by rail to Turkey, assembled by soldiers on site, and deployable medical infrastructure was designed really to address soldiers' health crisis. In this case, he had simple things like a hand cranked fan. He lifted the structures off the ground. There was a clear separation of air and water and plenty of breathability implemented within these simple structures. But the outcome was quite striking and radical. There was a near 70% reduction in deaths of the patients. We were having a huge issue of the soldiers dying who were in the clinic. And this reduction, this measurable reduction in death, this data really proved a correlation between air management, disease transfer, and the built infrastructure. It's what gave Nightingale the kind of spark to think differently about systems and to really change the way the next half century thought about infrastructure. Of course, deployable structures are still very present in our lives. This is West Africa. where Ebola's wrath was like even more contagious, where the very surfaces of buildings and skin were terrifying moments, infected patients. Here, extreme isolation and distancing revealed how personal protection and severe anxiety about touching were really the primary strategies for control and management, what we call personal protection. But we needed new infection protocols for isolation units and health worker safety in these deployable structures. These were large Ebola treatment units were being deployed very quickly, but the long-term implications of these new types of diseases had to be addressed as well. And so we worked with the government of Liberia for their new national hospital in New Caldwell in Monrovia, Liberia. It was called the New Redemption Hospital. And this facility introduces these kind of new protocols of infection control, especially around both airborne disease, but also fomite transmission and clear separation between patients and staff, and also having opportunities for when epidemics or infection happens or there's crisis, that there's clear ways that the hospital can adapt over time. The chimneys that you see here are all designed around this strategy of both natural ventilation, but a kind of forced natural ventilation. And we worked with the amazing group of Transolar to design these very site-specific air movement chimneys. This is a very wet climate, very humid climate. So the design is very site-specific, but it's always moving air through these ward spaces, regardless of the condition of the temperature outside, sized for that purpose, and also ensuring a kind of airflow management and control, even during the worst of the epidemic, a kind of resiliency. You know, among all the things I think we've experienced this past half year, I feel like I've been kind of proven, not right, but, you know, really validated on this one, which is like buildings hurt and buildings heal, and that air breathability is really the hill to climb. Buildings must breathe. I think this is a key fundamental idea that has been there from the beginning of buildings and will continue well past where we are today, and it's evident to all of us. And we woke up in March of 2020, really suddenly the world felt it too. And in March and April of 2020, we were, because of this research, approached by hospitals and medical groups. We've been doing this research for over a decade around breathability in medical facilities, and we were approached to address the conditions of the crisis at the height of the crisis. This is a shelter for Boston's Healthcare for the Homeless, an organization we had worked with before that was, you know, finding the cases were spiking in the community who were unhoused, and they needed care immediately. And they were asking us, how do you deploy a tent in 3 days, and how do we make sure it's coping with infection control when we weren't fully sure that it was fully airborne or what particulate size the COVID pathogens might contain. And, you know, in our experience, we were pretty persuaded that having the airflow management that we could use, let's say in the other buildings that we had designed, could also be productive and facilitate cleaner air in these environments. It would be a guess, but it was a hunch. And soon after that, we were approached by actually Mount Sinai Hospital, the research team at Mount Sinai in New York, where the spike of the epidemic was happening in April. And they were convinced, as they were redesigning the hospital on the fly, that the spaces around them were being shaped and redesigned by the staff and the doctors, and that they didn't have the kind of what they call the spatial awareness to fully make these decisions with them. So we strapped a bunch of GoPro cameras to a couple of research doctors. Our team worked, you know, over Zoom and in collaboration with their team to sort of develop some spatial awareness strategies to help them, as they were in the middle of the pandemic, recreate the spaces around them. Simple things like taking the exit plan, the fire plan for the exits, the plans of the buildings, and drawing in crayon where they thought the spaces were contaminated or clean, revealed a kind of complete disagreement across similar teams about where spaces were safe, where they could demask, where they had to don and doff, and what was contaminated or not. Just that simple exercise allowed them to sort of create more cleaner protocols and clarity around where they could operate and where they had to protect patients and staff, and how they might integrate and change the facility as it existed. And this led us to develop a series of guidelines. We created over a number of guidelines for different types of facilities, hospitals, clinics, of course, but also restaurants, museums, carceral facilities, senior housing, all introducing the idea of breathability as a primary metric, and then strategies that could be developed in order to reduce risk throughout the facilities themselves. Not surprising to any of you here, I'm sure, but none of these facilities are designed for air management. More than 2 or 3 air changes per hour does not reduce infection rates or contamination. And so optimizing and recalibrating our buildings, especially those which have been sealed shut, it becomes a huge hurdle we're facing with on our horizon as we think about a post-pandemic infrastructure. I go back to this is the Bellevue Hospital in New York, the kind of frightening plan of the medical facility we saw in the mid-century, and the kind of utopian experiments that emerged after the war to control air mechanically end up creating a very different type of floor plan, a very different type of infrastructure, a very different type of an interior environment. The plan gets fat, it takes over entire city blocks as this one does, it seals the windows, it controls everything from inside, and it creates an incredible sense of precarity and reliance on the mechanical systems around them. There are lots of examples of this, and I study them in the book because this paradigm shift in the mid-century is quite striking. I think it's also really exciting to think about the attempts of architects to try to address them and where they succeeded and also failed. This is, I think, one of the more successful attempts at the super building where this is the McMaster Hospital in Ontario by Zeidler and partners. A success would be maybe not the right word, but the kind of striking plan of this new city of health was designed to think about adaptability and growth over time. And each of these interior floor plates have themselves exterior spaces as the city can grow horizontally and vertically. Zeidler designed these stems. You can see them in the bird's eye view here, where the building could add floors over time. That kind of adaptability of the infrastructure is a very present one in medical facilities. This is really the super building or the kind of mega structure in full form. You don't see the mega structure truly appearing except in theory, but you do see it in the hospital. I think something that we should recognize as that kind of utopian imagination in the mid-century happening and being performed by the medical facility itself. You see that emerge not constructed, but at least theorized by Corbusier in the Matt Hospital in Venice. It too, struggling with how to control air and also where to place this in a historic city. Of course, he floats it over the lagoon and creates a facility without windows, a fascinating idea that one would be able to control everything from the inside and not need windows anymore. Other kind of radical examples of that happen in studies by Perkins and Will in the mid-century, as well as an underwater hospital or this kind of tree STEM hospital, which these sort of growing cities, the medical cities that they imagine as these sort of megaforms and massive institutions. These are drawings by Todd Wheeler, who was a partner at Perkins and Will in the mid-century. Kind of ideas about the future often find themselves within the hospital. I think that's also something to think about, something that's really informative of how we imagine these structures growing indefinitely and over time and trying to adapt for that future condition. We've had to think about that also in real time in our own projects. This is a project under design, soon to be under construction in Dhaka in Bangladesh. This is the Samagic Medical Complex with the Grameen Bank in Muhammad Yunus. And in this case, this is a city block facility, one with 500 beds and a large nursing school embedded within that block. Dhaka, of course, one of the great mega cities in the world, rapidly developing, and of course, planned to be or assumed to be underwater in years to come with climate change. This is an incredible urban condition, one where there's just an incredible amount of infrastructure being developed simultaneously, but also we can learn from the history of medical facilities to introduce a kind of mixed mode of air management. In this case, we both have natural and mechanical ventilation. The wards designed around that mixed redundant system, being high up in the building and leveraging lots of surface area of windows using the same principles the Nightingale talked about 150 years ago, but also creating that kind of public infrastructure, that public space of a new medical complex that will grow over time. And you can kind of see that here. This is exciting for us to think about how all these things come together. I mean, one beautiful facility we're able to do in Rwanda that's well into the country is not the condition of all hospitals, as we know, and they have to take these same principles and adapt them to their specific climate. And it is the climate that we're designing ultimately, right? As we address the interface of air into the exterior to the interior, it is that facade system, whether wrapped in hallways or fenestration or operability, it is that interrelationship of the indoor to the outdoor air environment, that breathability, that is the modulating factor of whether buildings allow us to heal. There's just another, you can see the wards at the top in this zigzag plan. One of the first principles that I think really primed me for this book and I studied is that the hospital itself, and I of course learned this from my own experience, I would say the hospital also represents our other public institutions, that they need to serve what we might call two publics, and often in contrasting ways. The hospital must serve you, the individual, and your experience, your lived experience, but it also has to address the broader goals of the public's health itself. And these two needs and demands of the institution are often, and sometimes in contrast, and when they work together in harmony, you see real balance. But it is that contradiction or that dual struggle, that split personality, which we find as the sort of generative design challenge of not just the hospital, but the institution, what the state represents in our public imagination, and also how we interrelate with the state, with the public through our facilities. I think Prentice, this is Prentice Women's Hospital in Chicago by Bertrand Goldberg, which no longer exists, but the split personality was so represented here and so clearly described as a diagram. The bottom is the super flexible mid-century modernist box with technology, air management that's mechanically constrained, has flexibility for adaptive needs of the hospital over time, and of course, no windows. And then the top is the kind of organic, customized, very user-centered bed experience designed around the unique relationship and the measurable relationship of the nurse to the patient and the patient's view of the city. The bottom is the city block, and the top is the inflexible architectural form designed around an idealized relationship in harmony with the individual and his or her experience. Design and technology forced and separated really clearly in this diagram. Prentice didn't survive, but it asked these questions. It was taken down about 6 years ago, but it asked these questions like, how can we serve the needs of the patients and give them a view of the city, give everyone a window, but also address the kind of complex, changing and iterating needs of the medical profession and medical research. But by doing this, by sort of separating them, Goldberg sparked new research into computer-aided design. This is one of the first CAD designed buildings. He developed new architectural structures like this quatrefoil cloverleaf design, which cantilevers off the stem, a kind of beautiful resolution of this relationship between the nurse and the bed. And of course, reimagine some of the sort of primary architectural precedents like the panopticon, the relationship between authority and service that are both, in a sense, utopian and whimsical, but also, I think, represent and ground those fundamental relationships, the DNA of all institutional facilities themselves. This research actually ended up being a kind of driving late career purpose of Goldberg and Associates. He designed innumerable examples of this central kind of iteration of the panopticon hospitals all over the country, different iterations of nurse and bed strategies, but all kind of generally addressing the kind of same set of kind of standard ideas that he could measure, a sort of DNA of every hospital, this relationship of patient staff that he was measuring. And Goldberg's work ends up, this is the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, where I reside and where my two children were actually born. And that you can still see the podium and the bed tower diagram emerging here in its own form. But in this case, in a very modern institution that's just constantly under adaptation and adoption, constantly evolving and changing, which introduces a secondary element of that's a sort of grounding principle of architecture, but you see it in the hospital, which is that the hospital is always under construction, or it's a living thing. Architecture is always under construction, it's a living thing, but it's the hospital which reveals it really clearly. And so how do we combine them? In this case, the buildings are driven along this, what they call the pike, this central corridor, which connects all the different infrastructures and facilities above them. You know, it's a sort of inelegant solution to an institution which is under evolution, but it does perform and work in a way that introduces new opportunities. It's been theorized that this is the interaction connector, this singular hallway, which is where everyone sort of connects and adds and builds knowledge while they're going from one part of the hospital to the next. At the end of the day, it's the experience through these institutions, which is the question though. Do you feel institutionalized? Do you feel a sense of orientation and know where you are, or do you feel lost in the institution? We often talk about the institution's design as a sort of perfect manifestation of the system itself. We feel lost in the medical system. Being in the hospital, we get lost and institutionalized also. So finding those moments, this is of course where design can assist, find those moments to ground and really geospatially orient ourselves, to remind us where we are and to give us a sense of presence and proximity. These are the moments that we have to sort of break through the institutionality that was so demanding and dominant in the mid-century and that architects have been struggling with ever since. Our own work is trying to do that both in terms of smaller, decentralized institutions. This is a family health center in McKinney, Texas, which opened in the last 2 years, but creating a kind of integrated community-based strategy. Here's just one example, but one that is part of the fabric of the community itself. This is serving largely underserved, underinsured individuals in the community and giving them not just a medical facility, but actually a community center where things like laundry and a computer lab and public services outside of just healthcare services in this outpatient clinic are provided. But of course, in addition, it's created the space for growth and adaptation over time and replicability in multiple phases as the services grow in this institution over time. You know, I'm reminded of sort of these folks who are struggling with these very ideas of institutionality, of the kind of post war era, what architecture and the built environment must be after such a paradigmatic shift in our understanding of who we are, of course, the war. And at the cusp of a sort of postmodern era, Giancarlo De Carlo, the Italian post-war modernist of Team 10, I think theorized it in a way that's always been inspirational to me. When he talked about the difference between form and systems, contemporary architecture, he says, tends to produce objects, while its real role should be that of generating processes. And the distortion or the kind of contradiction between form and process has consequences because it makes us think about buildings in a really narrow strip of what he calls a whole spectrum. It segregates it and leaves open the possibilities of dependency and megalomania, two things I think architects have often been chided as having, and leads to, I think importantly here, a sense of social and political indifference. You can't have social and political indifference if we think about institutions as fundamental to the distribution of rights. You can't have social and political indifference if we see architecture as a fundamental agent in this construction of our social and civil life. If we think about them only as objects and not as fundamental systems for our ability to live, then we are, of course, disoriented from the possibility of them achieving what they're fully possible of achieving. This is, of course, his point here, but it's obvious, it's sort of ever present in the hospital, always. And I think after the pandemic, it's ever present to us and how each of these buildings also are serving or affecting this way of thinking and way of addressing some way out of what we're stuck in now. I thought I would conclude just by saying that, of course, it is not just hospitals, it is all public facilities. And part of us dealing with this healing that we're forced to reckon with, what kind of infrastructures we might need in the future, we have to address all of the ways in which the spaces around us shape and drive and affect our health. I thought it kind of necessary in the face of the horrible atrocities our country is going through right now, and in Texas and in Buffalo and just today in Tulsa, about how just hopeless it seems where we are. And what we can do individually is really hard to determine. I'm not sure this is the answer, but as architects and designers, this was at least our attempt to start to address culture change first that affects social change. This is something we learned in our work in Montgomery and in some of our research around memorials. So this is the Gun Violence Memorial Project, which we launched in 2019, in the fall of 2019 in Chicago. And I was approached by these two amazing women, Annette Nons-Holt and Pam Bosley, whose sons were murdered on the streets of Chicago by guns. Annette's son was on a city bus going to work, and Pam's son was coming out of band practice at their local church, both killed by random acts of violence. And they approached me at the opening of our Montgomery Memorial and said, we need a memorial to our children, but also to all those that have been killed in America to gun deaths. And, started to transform. I mean, it really transformed me. It changed the way I thought about things. This sort of course, the sort of living epidemic that we're in the middle of, and there's no way out in a way. So these two women inspired me and changed my life. And I started to understand the sort of intensity of the epidemic that we're in, that this is more this year actually, but on average before the pandemic, about 700 people were killed a week by guns, about 100 people a day. And we often just hear, we don't hear their names, we often just hear their numbers. And of course, the debate continues to be polarized and terrifying of its negligence. But we were given some hope because we were reminded of another epidemic which seemed hopeless, and a cultural project really changed our approach as a nation. This is the AIDS Memorial Quilt, otherwise known as the Names Project. And during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the late 80s, early 90s, when politicians were fighting over treatment and there was a culture war about whether we should even name it publicly, there was, like all epidemics, an accusation of the moral integrity of its victims versus the science around its treatment. Activists developed a cultural project first, the AIDS Quilt, where they asked loved ones to create a single square, they called a panel, dedicated to their loved ones who died of the epidemic. Each rectangular panel tells the story of a loved one, a loss of life, their dignity preserved, but combined together in this form and on the National Mall, tell a national story of negligence, political failure, and collective memory. When you see 90,000 panels deployed on the National Mall, you start to see this as one of the largest memorials in the nation, a living memorial, one that is actively being changed and edited and added to, but also in its full distribution and display shows a national movement through culture change that affects social change. And it's a really important distinction that we're not affecting policy through laws, we're affecting it through cultural change. This did change the world. So many of the activists credit the AIDS Memorial Quilt as being a real turning point in the dialogue around HIV and AIDS, around treatment, around investment in science, and around the government acknowledging it and changing policy. So this was inspirational to us, and we thought, like, what would it be in the realm of gun deaths in America? So we came up with a simple strategy, which was to ask family members of victims to contribute, actually donate an object to us that we would then be a steward of. This is Pontillo's is a restaurant in Chicago, and this is the hat that was worn when her son was murdered, that she gave to us as a steward of that, or mementos of their loved ones that we could hold on to for a period of time. And then we would take these, we would accept these gifts, these sort of talismanic objects that represent these hidden lives which have been lost in the debate, objects of love and commitment, meet these family members across the table, hear their stories, retell their lives, and then give them equal space in this memorial. Each one is a glass house of 700 bricks, 700 being the number per week. And over time, we're collecting these objects from family members, and eventually the aspiration being to have one in every state, and then eventually on the National Mall. We've collected over 2,500 objects so far, and continued to have collection events throughout the country. And many have reached out to us over the last week. I don't know if it will change the dialogue, but it's at least something that we can do, and something that we can collectively contribute to. All of you in this room, if you're interested, don't hesitate to reach out to me. It reminds me that there's options. We have things that we can activate, and it might inspire or influence the ways we imagine the epidemics that are among us and that are actively happening right now, not just in the past. And of course, the last one is the COVID memorial. We've now hit over 1 million deaths in America, and calls for a COVID memorial are starting to emerge. We were asked by the Biden administration to put up a temporary COVID memorial at the inauguration in 2020, and our design, which was not built for certain reasons on January 6th, was to, at that time, 400,000 people had perished, was to introduce witness trees, a series of forests to replant the National Mall, much like Downing had originally designed it. You may know the history of the National Mall was originally a planted forest with trees from around the country by Andrew Jackson Downing, and the parade grounds that we know today was a renovation of the original design in the early part of the 20th century, to replant with witness trees, of course, being trees planted at special events and then either representing those eras, or in this case moved throughout the country, trees from around the nation representing different regions and different ecological conditions. And of course, at this period of time, we could hang mementos or objects from them that represent our loved ones on them. And then, of course, later, those trees would be moved and replanted around the country, representing the witnessing of that inauguration, but also the witnessing of this first initiative of memorialization of those lost to this pandemic. It wasn't built, but they did take some of that ideation and into a flag planting strategy, which was built. I still think this could be one idea for how we start to think about our loved ones that we've lost to this horrific era. So with that sober moment, I want to pause and open it up to questions, but I just want to say that the sort of broader strategy of thinking about the infrastructure around us that heals is not anchored only in medical infrastructure. It's the medical infrastructure which can inspire us to actually find answers to how each one of these pieces of infrastructure, each one of these buildings can allow us this broader understanding of our personal and public relationship to the possibility of access to rights and access to health. So thank you very much. Am I taking questions? I don't know how much time we have. Anyone have questions? Happy to answer. Yes, here in the front. Yeah.
I was thinking the question, honestly speaking, is still not constructed, so I'll try. So here is, I'm from Bangladesh. Thank you so much for presenting in the hospital. So there is a dilemma. So I'm from this world and that world, and the definition of access, right? People's right to the built environment and healthy environment, and it changes. In the United States or developed countries, people think these are my rights. And if you go back to Bangladesh or people, they think that I should, for example, our government is giving individual houses. And such a small country like Bangladesh, which is like very small and accommodate more than half of the population of the United States, giving individual houses to the people. I mean, just think about we're creating a concrete slum and very unhealthy environment. So how we can approach, or what would be our advocacy or movement for the world, because the world is diverse. Populations are, I mean, the distribution of the population and access to the health and built environment is not equal. So how we can make the movement which will basically give, like, this is the definition of you access to the healthy environment. To me, having like a village with a hut is better healthy environment rather than having a concrete slum, especially after the COVID, when we know that breathing space is such important.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that great summation. One of the things I didn't mention, but of course intended to mention, is the control and management of air. Of course, it affects our bodies, affects our communities, but of course it affects our climate, shaping the climate around us. As we know, buildings represent, in some estimates with transportation, 40% of all carbon emission in the built environment. So as we imagine, and we think about this a lot on the African continent, where we have a team doing a lot of work where a billion people will emerge in the next 30 years with the largest building boom in the world. If we don't begin right now to address a new way of breathability in our infrastructure that is both about how the buildings perform, but also about how we're managing supply chain, how we're reducing concrete, steel, and glass, how we're thinking about local materials, and about the carbon offsets of extraction and the material sourcing. If we don't create that as policy within emerging infrastructures, and we will face so much more significant and problematic and challenging climate crisis as we do today. So I think it is the responsibility, not responsibility, it's the opportunity of many of these countries which are investing in infrastructure rapidly right now as they're rapidly emerging to, I think, set the new paradigm that, countries like the United States, which are so bound up in an old way of building, are going to lag behind and sort of hopefully be inspired by, maybe state by state. But I see the opportunities certainly in our work in Rwanda and in countries like Sierra Leone, which are thinking about this radically, to take on a kind of complete overhaul of how we might build the cities of the future. Bangladesh has an opportunity Dhaka has an opportunity to really challenge that and really push that. And there's precedent, of course, in the mid-century, in the modern era of the construction of major cities in Southeast Asia. There was an idealization, a utopian idealization of new infrastructures which could shape these new nations. And I think that same kind of thinking, that regional thinking, could happen today and should happen today, or else we're not going to solve the climate crisis that's in front of us, for sure. Anyone else? Okay.
Thank you very much for that very inspiring presentation. One of the things that seem to be happening in developing worlds is, for lack of a better word, is a sense of mimicking the progressive countries like the West. So I come from one of those third world countries, so to quote unquote, and overall there's a tendency, if you mimic what the Western world is doing, you are more progressive. And it's for everything. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, to designing buildings that are sealed and centrally air conditioned. So the work that you're doing seems to be from a different perspective. Do you imagine that these would be mimicked so that we can get a different kind of architecture in these developing countries? Do you see yourself as a trendsetter for developments, as these kinds of projects that you're doing in Africa and Asia would become the trend that future architects, local architects would follow? Do you see yourself in those, with those kind of ideas, I guess?
let me answer that in two ways. Thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, first of all, the answer to your proposition is, I think, 100% yes, which is the future of architecture and design is not here in the US. It's in India, it's in Rwanda, it's in the emerging cities that we're seeing happen. And the architects and designers there are showing the way. I think you see the sort of new regionalism emerging in all sorts of ways, beautiful structures that are thinking about breathability, carbon capture, labor is an important piece of this, materiality, craftsmanship. And we've been inspired by those influences, trying to unlock and break open the crisis that we see in our own cities in the United States. That it's not just the building that's designed. I mean, you see it clearly in the ceiling of the mechanical system. I think there, if you're exporting that, you really are noticing a kind of crisis of how we understand air movement. But you also see it in the material choices that are baked into engineering standards, or baked into structural assessments. So we've been trying to push that in all sorts of ways. I'll give you an example. We built something in the Congo, in Democratic Republic of the Congo. It was very, very remote. And we were really trying to pilot the idea of reintroducing stone foundations, not concrete foundations. So in that way, both as a study and a research project, we had stone foundations. We were using mud construction and timber roofing, and trying to introduce as much sourcing of materiality from within a 100-mile diet as much as possible. We have about 90% of material sourcing within a 100-mile diet. We're just completing a new campus of 65 buildings in Rwanda, where we've controlled supply chain in such a way to keep that within an 80-mile radius diet, where the vast majority, about 95% of materials are within that range. And that's trying to suggest that you can have climate positive infrastructure built at day one, that you can source all materials and manage supply chain at a certain scale. You can control and lead to sort of social and economic investments in labor and craftsmanship if you prioritize it from the beginning. Those lessons are learned from precedents and examples of great designers all over the world, but often not in the US, where I think it's very difficult to do that same thing. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. And I think we have to sort of have that balance and that tension where we're collectively aiming towards some shared goal, which is a sort of climate positive infrastructure, decarbonized design strategies, and precedents which challenge our assumptions today about how things are built. And that means fundamentally the reduction in concrete, glass, and steel in our infrastructure, rethinking renewables and regenerative materials, rethinking labor, and also designing new heroic structures which serve the communities more directly. One way to think about it is I talk often about it as the slow food movement for architecture. Slow food is such a transformative paradigmatic shift in the way we think about what we eat. But it began by chefs, chefs like Alice Waters and others, advocating that the meals that they make should be regionally determined, invest in local, not just local and organically farmed, but also local farmers and regional suppliers, and that as Dan Barber at Stone Barns and Blue Hill at Stone Barns talks about this, it has to also be delicious. It has to taste really good. It has to be a great experience, or else culturally it won't sink in as something powerful and transformative. Change the world through deliciousness, he talks about. It's been really inspirational for me to think about that movement, which was addressing the great agricultural movements of the mid-century, which were very aligned with the infrastructural movements of the mid-century, the Green Revolution, as they called it, to provide basic food across the world. But it also changed the diets and changed the eating habits and changed the sourcing of food around the world. And the slow food movement has tried to break that open. And now, of course, we all talk about organics. We talk about so many restaurants have embraced that. There are regional investments in infrastructural changes around agrarian practices. And I think the tide now is, of course, in relationships to developing economies, is trying to push back against large agrarians, large agricultural conglomerates trying to change local sourcing of food in emerging economies. The same thing happens with material sourcing. So we look at that as we're like 20 years behind the slow food movement in buildings. If we talk about a slow space movement or a slow food movement for architecture, I think we can start to sort of reapply values, impacts, and design strategies from the beginning of the project that will have long-term ripple effects on the region over time. Yes, over there in the corner.
Hi, my name is Widya. Thank you for the presentation. I'm also from developing country. I'm from Indonesia. And I really appreciate when you said about breathing is breathe, or it's a spatial thing. And when we're talking about, in the era of COVID, and we're talking about like 6 feet distance, space is also a privilege. Not all people can maintain a 6 feet distance. Some people live in a 12 household number in a very small house. And then I was kind of looking at, when we're talking about healthy house, which is a big thing that's happening in Indonesia after the pandemic, people are like so into what are the guidelines for a healthy house. But then when we're looking into what really becoming the guides, it goes back to what's house are in where in Indonesia. It's like, it's a tropical country. It's, cross ventilation and all sorts of things. And then it gets into the discussion of technology. And there's a lot of discussions about technology and health. And when we're thinking about technology, something that comes into our minds is like, what's the latest technology? What's the latest digital technology? But essentially technology, wheels are technology, spoons are technology. It doesn't have to be the fanciest and the newest thing. So my question to you is, in your practice, when the word technology comes, or like when people comes to you and like, let's just insert this newest technology to this design, how would you see technology? And maybe give some examples of different types of technology that are not really digital technology oriented that can be incorporated into health and design. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the house is a technology. We often, I think there's so many lessons to learn from the vernacular, because the intelligence of a local building practice will, if you unpack it, will teach you about the climate, about the seasonal performance of a piece of infrastructure, about how communities and cultures have adapted over time to address their livability with climate and weather and patterns of preformance. And inserting a kind of technology, you saw this a lot in the mid-century, which was, and you see it in the narrative around prefabrication, inserting a kind of building technology as a solution of which may address things like speed and replicability and fidelity are not always necessarily the right solutions to climate, performance, adaptability, and livability. Those two things can be in conflict. We learn this, of course, from the medical professionals. Paul Farmer called it junk for the poor. Said everybody's introducing all these new medical technologies, but if they can't adapt to cultural use, they just get thrown in the corner in some room. We have to have a whole room full of all this wasted technology that doesn't work at all. Going back to first principles, how can we serve the patients? How do we serve them with what we have available? How do we do it with dignity and the best practice that we can possibly get? And how do we improve the quality overall through the system intervention? Is not about, no technology is a panacea. In fact, it's temporary, but the house as a technology is a permanent infrastructure which can show us adaptation over time. So I think it goes back to, I always try to sort of think about, at the core of it, if the architecture is just an object, it doesn't suggest these things. But if the architecture is a living thing, then you imagine it, as Nightingale did, performing in and behaving in relationship and response to you and your community as a public. And that's a really important way to think about how we might design it differently. I'm not going to say you don't introduce new types of technologies that might address that adaptation, but if you're not solving for that adaptation and evolution, you may not be finding the right technologies that are necessary and helpful. So we always try to think about and learn from the knowledge that's embedded in the soil. And from that, you might find answers for, what building infrastructure solutions might be necessary and could address these broader systemic issues that are in front of us.
Well, I think we're we've run out of time for questions. I'd like to thank Michael
Thank you very much.
for
Thanks,
an
Deb.
inspiring close to our day. And we look forward to seeing you all here again tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.